Hello, welcome to our horror genre presentation, obviously made by us three.
Horror subgenres are narrative set pieces. I'm just going to go through some of the subgenres and how their stories go. Action horrors usually have a good guy, will end up having to battle the bad guy. Good guy usually always wins. Gothic horrors, usually dark and scary, lacking happy endings, quite dark and depressing. Comedy horrors, usually has a main focus which creates fear, but it's still funny, allowing puns and or happy or neutral endings. Psychological horrors relies on the emotions and views of the character you're following to create fear for the viewer. Science fiction horrors usually involves facing an enemy, alien, mutants, superheroes or creatures, which cause a lot of havoc and, like many people, die. The creatures are killed and everything is fine in the end. Slashers has an insane killer on the loose, he's eventually caught and or killed. Zombie films, zombie apocalypse has broken out, and you follow the story of the survivors.
Action horrors are a combination of the action film genre and the classical horror. Often they contain scenes of violence and intense gunfights and chases that combine with the dark, scary atmosphere to make an action horror, often revolving around an evil or scary event such as The Purge and The Purge Anarchy. Action horrors include The Purge Anarchy, Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters, and Van Helsing. The action genre obviously requires action, since none of us happen to be black belts or samurais. This would prove too difficult for us, not to mention the camera work involved.
Zombie films, well, they obviously feature zombies or living corpses that terrorise human characters, often in a post-apocalyptic scenario such as The Road. Jump scares are a huge section of zombie films, which are used to scare the audience, and they're often set in urban settings such as The Mist. And they focus on the protagonist and their family struggle to survive, such as The Happening. Zombie films include 28 Days Later, Night of the Living Dead, and Dawn of the Dead. We don't have the resources to create different zombies, as, well, firstly we need makeup, secondly we need someone to actually use the makeup, which, being boys, none of us are familiar with, and plenty of clothing and actors to actually play the zombies.
Science fiction horrors. This genre of horror combines science fiction and horror, obviously. Often we use it such of aliens, as in the film Alien, and space aggressors as basis for horrors to the character in the film usually. Horror is normally created through the power of scariness of the monsters and aliens. Examples of science fiction horrors include Alien, The Thing, and Event Horizon. We decided not to focus on science fiction horror as a genre, as it usually needs a large budget for the effectiveness and the aliens and I do not believe we could make it believable or nearly as effective with our budget and our time frame. The typical music of this genre would be eerie and try to bring tension to the situation to make the aliens seem more scary.
Gothic horrors are often set in a dark, gloomy, miserable setting, such as in an ancient castle with dungeons or forests and barren landscapes. They often use revenge or ancient prophecies, or the supernatural, such as ghosts and curses, and often feature an isolated, lone protagonist. Gothic horrors include films such as Dracula, The Mummy, and Frankenstein. We thought it would be best to avoid this, though, as we have no means of obtaining the setting these types of films are in, like a castle or a cave. Much like science fiction, the music would be eerie and would fit the situation.
Comedy horror. This subgenre combines horror and comedic films. So-called gallows humour is normally used, which is black comedy, referring to death joyfully. Examples of comedic horrors include Shaun of the Dead, Lesbian Vampire Killers, and An American Werewolf in London. We decided not to choose comedy horror, as our chosen genre as comedy is a notoriously hard genre to go into, and we're not funny enough to do it effectively, to be honest. We wouldn't have the first clue of how to make people laugh, as obviously everyone's humour is different, so it would be a dangerous genre to use. Music of this genre would be a bit more upbeat to create humour, generally.
Psychological horror are much different from other horror genres. These focus more on the character, protagonist fears, and mind, such as the protagonist from the killing kind. It's not usually as scare-orientated or featuring gore as other films. There are normally a plot twist and often focus on protagonists and characters in a conflict or state of mind. Tension is normally not built through scares, as in most horror genres, but through the atmospheric, music, and sound effects, and the character's psychology. Psychological horrors examples include The Shining, Pig, and The Omen. We chose psychological horror as our genre because it felt like that it would be both challenging and interesting. Therefore, we would be able to use all of our skills to create an intriguing piece. The music would a lot more fast-paced and slow-paced at certain points to fit the character's mood that it's following.
Slashers, then, finally, are often referred to due to the intense, brutal violence and gore in this certain film. Often they refer to a murderer or serial killer, or even a psychopath, hunting or chasing his victims and kills them with intense graphic violence and gore. Many of these films are iconic and gain huge success, such as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, pictured to the left. Examples of slasher films include the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Friday the 13th, and Maniac. Although this will not be our main theme, we decided to use certain elements from this genre as we would like to include some form of murderer.